A widow knelt in the snow and pressed her bare hand against the frozen ground, as if she could still feel something breathing underneath it. Below her, the town was dying. Not all at once. The slow way. One cold meal at a time. One quiet child at a time. The kind of dying that doesn't scream. It just stops asking for more. She had watched them laugh at her. For 3 years. They called her Shed a Madhouse. They said grief had broken something in her head, that a woman alone on a hillside, drying fruit nobody wanted, had clearly lost her way. She let them talk, because behind that small wooden door, on shelves she had built with her own 2 hands, sat enough food to keep every one of those people alive through the longest winter of their lives. 232 pounds of it. And not one of them knew. Now the trains had stopped. The snow had swallowed the pass. And the same men who had mocked her were counting the days until the hunger came for their children, too. She stood up slowly. She looked down at the smoke rising thin and weak from the houses she had been told she didn't belong to. Then she turned toward the door. It was time they learned what the mad woman had been building. The wind came down off the ridge before the sun did. It moved through the pines like something searching, slow, patient, cold. And on a hillside above a sleeping town, a woman stood in the doorway of a small wooden shed and watched her breath turn to smoke in the dark. Her name does not matter yet. To the town below, she was only the widow, the strange one, the one who lived where no sensible person would. But her name was Edith Marsh, and she was 44 years old the morning everything she knew was taken from her. It happened the way the worst things always happen, quietly, without warning. A man kissed his wife before dawn and walked out the door to do the work he had always done. Samuel Marsh was a good man, steady hands, a soft voice, the kind of husband who noticed when the lamp oil ran low before she had to ask. The kind who carried an injured friend down off a slope without once complaining of the weight, and then never spoke of it again. He was not a complicated man. He was a good one, which, as the world goes, is the rarer thing by far. That morning, he said something ordinary, something forgettable. Later, she could never call it back, no matter how she tried. Something about the weather, perhaps, or the lamp oil, or nothing at all. He picked up his hat. He walked out the door. And then a tree came down wrong in the timber, the way trees sometimes do. And the ordinary life she had built ended in a single, soundless afternoon. They carried him home. They told her he had lived a little while, long enough to say 2 things to the men around him. The first was that he loved his wife. The second was a strange and gentle thing. He had asked them to tell her to forgive the tree. She did both. Forgiving the tree came easy. It was only a tree. It had meant nothing by what it did. It had simply been standing where it stood, the way trees do, until the day it wasn't. The other forgiveness would take far longer, but that is a thread for later in the telling. For now, they carried him home, and she did not scream. She did not fall. She sat at the kitchen table with her hands folded, and she looked at the door he had walked out of, and she waited for him to come back through it. He never did. 2 weeks later, a man from the company stood on her porch and held out a plain envelope. He had the look of someone hoping very much that she would not weep or shout or make the moment any harder than it had to be for him. Inside the envelope was a small sum of money. That was all. That was what a lifetime of a man's work had been judged to be worth by men in distant offices who had never once heard his voice. She took it. She did not weep in front of him. She thanked him, and she showed him to the door, and she closed it gently behind him. And then she sat alone in the quiet, turning the envelope over and over in her hands. And she understood something that would shape the rest of her days. No one was coming to save her. She would have to save herself. Now, a softer woman might have gone home to her people, folded back into the life she had left. A widow returning to the place she came from. That was a story the world knew how to receive. People would have nodded and made room, and been kind in the way that asks nothing in return, and offers nothing much either. But Edith had been raised by a mother who knew things most people had forgotten. Her mother, Maribel, had come from hard hill country, where winters were long and mercy was thin, and where a woman learned young that the difference between living and starving was the work she did with her own 2 hands in the warm months. How to dry fruit, how to keep it, how to turn the abundance of one short summer into food that would last through the cruelest winter. It was not a hobby in that country. It was not a charming domestic skill. It was the thin, invisible line between a family that came through to spring and a family that did not. Maribel had learned it from her own mother, and she from hers. A long chain of women whose names were written in no book anywhere, but whose hands had kept their people alive through season after season that would have killed them otherwise. And Edith had absorbed it all the way children absorb a language. Not from study, from standing close, from watching and repeating, and being handed the knife a little younger each year. By the time she was a girl, she could look at a piece of fruit and know its worth by touch alone. She could tell its ripeness by the give of it under her thumb, its sugar by the smell, the exact narrow window in which it could be saved, or spoiled by waiting one day too long. It was knowledge that lived in her fingers more than in her mind. So when she sat at that kitchen table with the envelope in her hands, she did not reach for comfort. She reached for a map. She spread it flat on the table where his coffee cup had sat that morning, and she bent over it, and she read it the way other women read scripture. She studied the shape of the land, the slope of the hills, the way the morning sun would strike one particular hillside first and stay on it longest, the marks that told of old homesteads, abandoned orchards, valley bottoms settled long ago and half forgotten since. And she saw in those marks what no one else would have seen: wild fruit, untended trees, whole hillsides of abundance going to waste year after year because no one for miles around knew what she knew or cared to learn it. She made her decision before she had even finished reading. It was not a decision about grief. It was not about solitude or about what a widow was supposed to do with the rest of her days. It was a decision about work, about what her hands knew, about what one particular hillside in one particular valley might offer to a woman who could read it. She folded the map. She packed 2 trunks and a crate of tools. She loaded her old bay mare into a stock car, and she rode east into the mountains toward a small town she had never seen, where no one was waiting for her, and no one wanted her. She arrived on a gray afternoon with a little money in her pocket and a kind of clarity that most people spend their whole lives chasing and never quite catch. The town was built on confidence. Confidence in the timber money, in the supply trains that came like clockwork, season after season, carrying everything a family might need, in the general store that could give them all of it for the right price. It was not arrogance exactly. It was only the easy assumption of people whose needs had always been met by a system that, in all their experience, had simply never failed them. And the man who held that confidence in the palm of his hand was named Harlan Pike. Pike owned the store on the largest corner in town. 52 years old, red-bearded, with small eyes that were always moving, always counting, always sorting the world into what was useful to him and what was not. He had run that store for a dozen years. He set the prices. He extended the credit. He decided in the quiet way that men of small power decide such things, who would prosper in that valley, and who would find every road just a little harder than it needed to be. In a place like that, a man like Pike was not just a shopkeeper. He was the gate everything passed through. When the widow came in asking about land, it was Pike she spoke to first. Because in that town, anything that involved money changing hands eventually came to rest at his counter. He looked her over the way he looked over everything, measuring what it was worth to him. A widow, middle-aged, no family in sight, no husband to stand behind her, no men to make trouble on her account. He named a parcel on the steep east hillside, rocky, too sharp for a plow, too poor for grazing, the kind of ground a man held only because no one had ever offered to take it off his hands. He named a price he was sure was more than the dirt deserved. And then he waited for her to flinch. She didn't. She turned and looked up at that hillside. But she did not look at it the way a buyer looks at land, calculating what might be built, what might be grown, what might be wrung out of it. She looked at it the way a reader looks at a page written in a language only she could understand. The slope of it, the way the early light would pour across it before it touched anywhere else in the valley. The way the afternoon wind would come down off the ridge, steady and clean, and sweep that whole hillside from one end to the other, reliable as a clock. Heat and moving air. That was the secret her mother had taught her, the secret that no factory in any far-off city had ever quite learned. Fruit does not dry in heat alone. Heat alone only cooks it, ruins it, cooks away the very thing that makes preserved fruit worth eating at all. But heat and steady, patient air, held low and held even, that turns one short summer into food that can sit on a shelf for years and still feed a starving body fully when nothing else on earth is left. That hillside was not useless. To her, it was the single most valuable piece of ground in the entire valley. "I'll take it," she said. 2 words, quiet, certain. Pike took her money and handed her the deed, pleased with himself, certain he had gotten the better of a foolish woman who didn't know rock from soil. But as she turned to go, something in him kept watching. Not respect, not yet. The look of a man who has just felt something slip past him that he doesn't quite understand and doesn't like. She left his store without another word. And here is the thing about Harlan Pike that no one in that town knew. The moment the door closed behind her, he turned to the boy who swept his floors, and in a low voice, he told him to go and find out exactly what the widow was doing to that fruit, the steps of it, the methods, every small detail he could gather without being seen to ask. "Just write it down," Pike said. It was not curiosity. It was the instinct of a man who had built his entire life on owning the only thing of value in a town, and who could already feel, somewhere beneath his fine red beard and his easy smile, the ground beginning to shift beneath him. But that is a story for later. For now, the widow walked up the frozen path to 2 acres of rock and slope and morning light. And she did not build a house. She built a shed. She built it first, before a roof for her own head, before a bed, before warmth. She would sleep rolled in blankets against the cold and the damp until it was finished, because the shed was the thing that mattered, and a woman who knew her own mind did not put comfort before the work. And when the townsfolk passed on the road below and saw the strange structure rising on the hillside, with its slatted walls and its open frames, none of them could make sense of it. Not one of them offered to help. They only watched. And they began, in the careful, cruel way that small towns do, to talk. She let them, because she was not building for them. Not yet. She was building for a winter she could feel coming, long before any of them believed it ever would. She pressed her forehead against the warm neck of her mare in the failing light, and she let herself feel tired, just for a moment, just one. Then she straightened. She picked up her hammer, and the woman the whole town would soon call mad went back to work. The shed rose against the sky in 11 days. 11 days of a woman working alone from the first gray light until her hands could no longer find the nails in the dark. She measured every board by eye. She set every shelf with the care of a woman who knew that one crooked frame, one careless gap, could ruin a whole season's work and a whole winter's hope along with it. The walls were not solid. That was the point. She built them with narrow gaps, slats laid with space between them so the wind could pass straight through and never sit still long enough to let the damp settle and rot what hung inside. 3 rows of shelving, waist, shoulder, and overhead, each one holding sliding frames stretched tight with fine cloth, so that fruit at different stages could be tended without ever disturbing the pieces further along. A small stone firebox at the far end, for the damp, gray days when the sun was too shy to do its work alone. And the whole structure was turned, just so, to catch the wind that came down off the ridge every afternoon like a promise kept. It was, in its quiet way, a beautiful thing. A thing that married knowledge to patience, and asked only time of the woman who tended it. But no one in the town below saw beauty. They saw a strange wooden box on a useless hill, built by a widow who should have known better. The men passed on the road and looked up and said nothing. The women passed and looked up and said a great deal, though never to her face. And the widow worked on, as if she could not hear them, as if she had decided, somewhere deep inside, that their opinions weighed less than a single dried apple ring. On the 3rd day, a figure appeared at the edge of the clearing, a woman, carrying a jug of cold water. She was younger than Edith by a few years, thin in the way of someone who has learned to make a little go a long way. Her face had the worn softness of a woman who had buried more than she had been allowed to keep. Her name was Marion Doyle. She had a small farmstead further up the hill, 2 children to raise, and no husband left to share the weight of either. She did not come with judgment. She came with water. She stood at the edge of the clearing and looked at the half-built shed for a long moment. "What is it?" she asked. And the widow, who had not spoken more than 10 words to another soul in days, told her. She explained the slats, the wind, the reason the frames slid free, the plain, hard difference between fruit that was cooked and fruit that was dried, and why the whole of it came down to moving air. She spoke plainly, no pride in it, no performance. Just the truth of the thing, laid out like clean tools on a clean cloth. And Marian Doyle did something almost no one in that town had done. She listened. She did not arrange her face into the careful blankness people wore when they had already decided you were a fool and were only waiting politely for you to stop talking. She listened. She asked one good question about the frames. Then she nodded slowly. "That makes sense," she said. 4 words. But to a woman who had been alone with her grief and her hammer for longer than she cared to count, those 4 words landed like warmth on frozen hands. Marian came back the next day, and the day after. She did not become a shadow. She did not hover or pry or make herself into a project, but she became something rarer than a helper. She became a witness, and in a town that had already decided what the widow was, a single honest witness was more than Edith had dared to hope for. The house came second. 1 room, a sleeping loft, a stone fireplace, a small lean-to against the north wall for the mare, so the old girl would be snug and dry when the cold came down hard off the ridge. It was small. It was plain. But it was hers. Built with money she had counted twice before she ever stepped off that train, and once more after. And when the first hard frost came, she stood in the doorway of her little house and looked out at the valley below, with its warm lights and its full storefronts and its easy, unbothered confidence. And she felt no envy. She felt only the quiet certainty of a woman who knew something the valley did not. Then the harvest began. And this was where the widow came alive, because the hills around that town were drowning in fruit, and no one had ever bothered to notice. Wild plum down in the creek bottoms, heavy and dark and sweet. Wild apple in the old clearings from trees planted long ago by families who had moved on years before and left their orchards to the birds and the deer. Service berries up on the high meadows. Blackberries swallowing every fence line for a mile in each direction. Untouched, going dark and soft and falling. Year after year, all of it had dropped to the ground and rotted into the dirt because no one for miles thought it worth the trouble to gather. The town was starving and did not know it. Surrounded on every side by food, it had simply taught itself not to see. But the widow saw. She loaded her mare's sled and worked the hillsides from dawn until her back ached and her fingers were stained dark with juice and her shadow ran long across the ground. She sorted as she picked. Firm fruit here, overripe there. Bruised pieces cut away with the quick, sure flick of a knife that had been doing this exact work since she was a child too small to reach the table. Nothing wasted, not one good ounce. Waste in the country she came from was very near to a sin. And every fruit had its own secret. Apples, cored, peeled, sliced thin and even, dipped quick in salt water so they would not brown before their time. Pears, halved, brushed with the thinnest wash of honey, until the dried surface glowed soft and gold as candlelight. Plums, split and laid open to the air, cut side up, so the sweetness could draw down deep into the flesh and the moisture could leave it clean. Cherries, kept whole, stems pulled, dried slow and low to hold both their color and their summer heart. She filled the frames, she slid them into the dark of the shed. She turned them and tended them and read them by smell and by touch, the way a mother reads a sleeping child. And one row at a time, the shelves began to fill. When the first batch was ready, she held a single apple ring up to the light. It was the color of old leather, soft, bending without breaking. And when she tasted it, it was summer, concentrated, whole. The taste of a warm afternoon that had been folded up small and saved against a colder day. She wrapped a generous sample in clean cloth, and she walked it down the hill to the one man who could put it on a table where the whole town would see. She walked into Harlan Pike's store. The place was busy that afternoon. A handful of customers between the shelves. A woman waiting at the counter with a list in her hand. Pike looked up from his ledger, saw who it was, and looked back down, in a way that told her, without a single word, that he was busy with something that mattered a great deal more. She waited. When her turn came, she laid the cloth bag on the counter between them and opened it. Pike picked up one ring, held it to the light, smelled it, bent it slowly between two thick fingers, the way a man handles some unfamiliar material he has already decided he does not want. Dried fruit, he said, flat, bored. Dried apple, she answered. First quality, from the old orchards above the creek. There will be a great deal more by spring. She kept her voice steady, plain, the voice of a woman stating facts, not begging favors. I'd like to sell it, from a table outside your door, on market days. That's all I'm asking. Pike set the ring down on the counter, and his small eyes moved across her face, not searching for the truth of her, but for what was useful to him in the moment. Mrs. Marsh, he began, and the whole store seemed to lean in, the way a room does when a powerful man decides to be patient with someone he believes is beneath him. I carry everything this town needs, right here. That includes dried fruit, when the train brings it. Real dried fruit, from real companies, in proper packaging, with proper labels. He waved one hand at the bag as if brushing away a bad smell. What you've got here, it's homemade, cooked up in a shed by a widow with too much time and too little sense. People want what they know. Labels, names. They want to know who made a thing and where it came from. Not something a strange woman dried on a hillside. The widow did not raise her voice. It isn't cooked, she said quietly. It's dried. There's a considerable difference, but Pike had already turned the page in his mind. The answer is no, Mrs. Marsh. It would give the wrong impression. She looked at him for one long moment. She did not argue. She did not plead. She folded the cloth back over her apple rings, thanked him for his time, in a voice so even it made the refusal sting worse than any shout ever could have. And she walked out. The little bell over the door rang behind her, and in the silence that followed, Harlan Pike did something strange. He stood looking at the door for a moment longer than he needed to. Then he turned to the boy who swept his floors and spoke in a different voice, lower, careful. That's salt water she dips the apples in, and whatever it is she does with the honey on the pears. He paused. Write it down. It was not respect. It was a precaution. because somewhere beneath all that confidence, Harlan Pike had felt something he could not name, the faint, cold draft of a future he did not control, slipping under a door he had always believed was shut tight. Near the shelves, a broad-shouldered man had been quietly studying a tin of coffee through the whole exchange. His name was Otis Granger, 58 years old. A timberman for most of his life, with the heavy stillness of someone who had long ago decided that silence cost a man far less than speech ever did. He looked up when the widow set her bag on the counter. He watched her face while Pike turned her away. He looked at the apple rings, golden in the cloth. And then he looked at the floor. He bought his sack of flour. He nodded to Pike, and he walked out. But on the road, he stopped. He looked up at the east hillside, where a thin line of smoke rose from a shed he now understood was not a cabin at all. He stood there a moment longer than a man stands by accident. Then he walked on, carrying a small, quiet shame he would not understand the full weight of for a long while yet. The refusal at the store was the first wound. The town gave her the second, because there is a kind of cruelty that does not need fists or shouting or anything so honest as a raised hand. It only needs a saloon, an audience, and a man who confuses what he has built with the right to judge everyone who built something different. That man was Boyd Tanner. Tanner owned the sawmill that fed half the families in that town. 48 years old, thick through the neck, a man who had made something real with his own two hands, and had never quite forgiven anyone who had made something he didn't understand. He stood in the saloon one evening, warm with drink in the comfort of a crowd, and he announced, loud enough for every man there to hear, that the widow's little fruit business was a small and sad venture, born of a small and sad life. And the men laughed. Otis Granger laughed too. He would remember that laugh later. He would carry it home with him and lie awake beside it in the dark. But that night, he laughed with the rest of them, because it was easier than not laughing, because a man in a crowd is a smaller, weaker thing than he likes to believe. And it did not stop with the men. Tanner's wife was a woman named Delphine, 44 years old, always dressed with careful precision, with a voice that was always soft, and somehow always cutting. She did not shout. Women like Delphine never had to. She gathered the churchwomen into a circle, and she steered the talk, gentle as a hand on a rudder, until it drifted exactly where she had meant it to go all along, toward the widow on the hill. "The poor creature," Delphine murmured, her eyes full of practiced sorrow. "She's clearly been undone by losing her husband, drying hundreds of pounds of fruit all alone in a shed. It borders on mania, doesn't it? One does worry." And the circle nodded, because it is always easier to pity a woman than to wonder, even for a moment, whether she might be wiser than you. The verdict spread the way verdicts do in small places, quietly, completely, like cold water finding every crack in the stone, and the shed earned a name. They called it the Widow's Madhouse. It moved through the town in a single week, because a cruel name always travels fast when it gives people permission to believe the thing they already wanted to believe. Marian Doyle heard it first, and she carried it up the hill on a gray afternoon, the way she carried everything. Straight, without softening it into something easier to swallow. The widow stood in the doorway of the shed and looked out over the valley for a moment. The madhouse. Then she went inside. She took down the tally she kept on a shelf near the door, and she noted the weight she had added that day. She thought, for a moment, about the pear trees on the north slope, and what they might give if she tended them right come spring. She lifted 9 pounds of dried pear onto the shelf with the others, and she wrote the number down in her clear, steady hand. Marian watched her from the doorway. "You don't want to say anything to them?" she asked. The widow closed her ledger. "Mockery is the tax that lazy people pay to busy ones," she said. A pause. "I don't have the time to go and collect it." And that was all. She went back to work. She worked through the long, bright days and the first cold ones, with the patience of a woman following a plan instead of chasing a feeling. She planted young apple trees and pear whips on her steep hillside, small things that would not bear fruit for years and years. Investments in a future she fully intended to be standing in. She trained blackberry canes along a sun-warmed fence line to make the picking practical. She made quiet trades with 2 families further up the valley, swapping dried fruit for the right to pick their service berry patches when the season turned. And her hands grew wiser with every passing season. She learned that plums dried slower, at a lower heat, came out sweeter and softer, little dark jewels of concentrated summer. She learned that cherries dried best on damp days, set over the open firebox, with the door cracked just so to let the air move steady through. She found a way to press service berries into dense, dark cakes, wrapped in waxed cloth, light enough to carry in a coat pocket, rich enough that a single one the size of a man's palm could carry a working body through a whole hard day of labor. Behind her little house, she dug a second room down into the cool earth, lined it with cedar planking to keep out the damp and the insects, and there she stored what the shed produced. Cloth sacks tied at the neck, wooden boxes, sealed and labeled in her careful hand, and the ledger tracked it all, every pound that came in, every variety, every date, every pound that ever went back out. The number on the page climbed slowly, season after season after season, until one day it read, 232 pounds. 232 pounds of summer, counted and labeled and waiting in the dark. And when that number reached the town below, it did not bring respect. It brought laughter. Pike heard it from a customer and repeated it in his store, shaking his head slow, performing his bewilderment for whoever happened to be listening. 230 pounds of dried fruit, he said. The woman's lost her head entirely. Who on earth needs that much fruit? They'll bury her in prunes before they ever lay her in the ground. Boyd Tanner heard the same number down at the saloon and laughed until his eyes watered. Maybe she means to open a shop, he wheezed. Madness. Sold by the pound. And the widow heard all of it, through Marian, who reported it the way she reported the weather, plainly, without flinching, and without making it worse than it was. The widow opened her ledger. She added 9 more pounds of dried pear. She updated the tally. She closed the book, and she said nothing. But here is the thing the town could not see, from down in their warm and easy valley. Behind that careful, quiet face, the widow was not untouched. She felt every name they threw, She was a woman, not a stone. There were nights she lay in the loft and listened to the wind work through the slats of the shed and wondered if they were right. If grief truly had bent something in her, some hinge in the soul that no longer swung the way it ought to. If a sensible woman would have gone home, folded herself back into the ordinary world, and let the wild fruit rot in the dirt like everyone else did and always had, on the hardest of those nights, she would reach for the gray shawl folded at the foot of the bed. Her husband had given it to her once in the second year of their marriage. He'd said the blue one she had wasn't warm enough for mountain winters, and he would not have her cold. She would wrap it around her shoulders in the dark, and she would breathe, because the truth she never said out loud, not even to Marion, was this. She did not dry that fruit, only to survive. She dried it to keep from coming apart. The work was the thing that held her together, the measuring, the sorting, the slow, patient turning of one summer into something that would last through any winter. Her hands knew what to do, even on the mornings her heart did not. And there was that grief inside her she had never quite finished. She had forgiven the tree easily. It was only a tree. But forgiving her husband, for walking out that door, for not being more careful, for not somehow finding a way to still be standing in that kitchen, pouring his coffee in the morning light when he was 70 years old, that forgiveness came slow. She never quite finished it, but she made her peace with the unfinished part of it. And on the hillside, with her hands full of work and her shed full of summer, that peace was almost enough. Almost. Down in the valley, far from her ledger and her shawl and her quiet, unfinished grief, something else was beginning to come apart. Because Harlan Pike was not the man the town believed him to be. He stood behind his counter with the ease of a king. He set his prices. He extended his credit. He played day after day the part of the man who held the whole town safe in the palm of his hand. But late at night, when the store was dark and the shades were drawn, Harlan Pike sat with a different ledger open before him, and the numbers in that one did not climb. They sank. He had borrowed deep to keep his shelves full and his image bright. He had stretched himself thin against credit he was no longer certain he could ever repay. His whole life, his standing, his power, the respect he wore like a fine wool coat, was built on a foundation he could feel softening beneath him a little more with every season. He needed the trains to keep coming. He needed the money to keep moving. He needed the town to keep believing, above all else, that he was the source of every good thing that reached them. And on the worst nights, he would think of that widow on the hill, with her useless land and her 232 pounds of fruit, and her quiet, certain face that had never once flinched at his price. And he would feel that cold draft again, the one he could not name. So he did the only thing a frightened man who refuses to admit his fear knows how to do. He mocked her louder. He dismissed her harder. He made certain that everyone in town saw her as small, so that no one would ever once look up at that hill and wonder whether the strange widow knew something he did not. It was easier to call her mad than to admit, even in the privacy of his own dark store, that he was afraid she was right. And so the seasons turned. The valley laughed. The widow worked. Pike performed his confidence by day and counted his fear by night. And high on the hillside, behind a slatted wooden door the whole town had learned to mock, 232 pounds of summer sat in the dark, counted, labeled, waiting, for a winter that none of them, not the laughing men, not the whispering women, not even Pike with his sinking ledger, believed would ever truly come. But it was coming. It was already on its way down, out of the high country, slow and silent and patient as the wind. And when it arrived, it would not care in the least who had laughed. It would only ask one question of every soul in that valley. What did you put away while you still had the chance? The first train that did not come frightened no one. Delays happened in winter. Everyone knew that. A storm up in the high country could push an arrival back a day or two, and no one lost a wink of sleep over it. The store was well stocked. 2 days was nothing at all. People noted the absence the way you note a small inconvenience, a shrug, a slight rearranging of plans, a reasonable, comfortable belief that things would sort themselves out the way they always had. The second train that did not come made people uneasy, and the third was the one that mattered. It was meant to carry not only flour and coffee and salt, but the small comforts families had been waiting on for weeks. Candy for the children, a bolt of good cloth a woman had been promised, a particular tin of tobacco that Otis Granger allowed himself just once a winter, because it was the kind his father had smoked, and lighting it was his quiet, private way of marking the passing of another year. When the day came and went without the long, low cry of a whistle in the valley, the unease curdled into something colder. The snow kept falling. It came down soft at first, almost gentle, the kind of snow that makes a town look like something out of an old storybook, all hushed and white and lovely. Then it kept coming, and kept coming, until the pass through the high country, the one road in, the one road out, was buried so deep that the world beyond the mountains might as well have stopped existing altogether. The engines that should have come to clear the line sat frozen and useless, far away, waiting for a thaw that simply would not arrive. And the town, that bright, confident town that had built its whole life on the certainty of things arriving, woke one gray morning to understand that nothing was coming. Nothing at all. Now, hunger does not arrive all at once. That is the cruel patience of it. It comes in stages, the way serious things always do. First, as inconvenience, a favorite thing gone from the shelf, a meal made a little plainer than the week before. Then, as worry, a mother counting what is left in the bin, and counting it again, hoping against all sense that the number will somehow change. And finally, as a quiet, heavy waiting that settles into every room of every house and refuses, no matter how you plead with it, to leave. The store had begun the cold season well stocked. Pike had seen to that. His shelves had been full and bright and proud as ever. But full shelves empty faster than anyone expects when the road closes behind them and nothing comes to fill the gaps. Flour went first. It always does. Flour is the foundation of everything a kitchen builds. And when it began to run low, the lack of it spread through every meal in every home like a crack spreading through river ice. Pike sold it by the bag until he could not, then by the cup, then by the half cup, Then he stopped selling it at all and kept what little remained back behind his counter, where no one could see it, and where he could pretend it was not nearly gone. Sugar vanished. Coffee followed close behind, and the prices on the board behind Pike's head began to climb, in a way that told their own ugly story to anyone who cared to read it. A sack of flour that had once cost almost nothing climbed to several times its worth, then several times that again, then to numbers that made grown men go quiet and turn their faces away. Pike crossed out the old prices and wrote the new ones above them, over and over, until the whole board was a ladder of desperation climbing toward the ceiling. He told himself it was business. He told himself a man had the plain right to charge whatever the market would bear. But late at night, with his own sinking ledger open before him and his own children's thin faces rising up in his mind, even Harlan Pike could no longer quite believe his own excuses. Otis Granger came in on a cold morning and asked for a pound of coffee. Pike looked at him from behind the counter, and his face had lost something. The easy confidence was gone from it. What had replaced it looked from a certain angle, in a certain light, almost like honesty. "I've got 4 pounds left," Pike said, "for the whole store. I'm rationing it now." Otis stood very still. He had been buying his provisions in this store for as long as he could rightly remember. He had watched Pike run it like a man who had never once in his whole life seriously doubted himself. "You told me, back before the snow, that the train would come," Otis said. His voice was level, the careful, controlled level of a man working very hard to hold something heavy down. "It will come," Pike said, but the words had no weight to them anymore. They were the words of a man saying a thing because it needed to be said, not because he believed a syllable of it. Otis looked at the half-empty shelves. He looked at the ladder of crossed-out prices climbing the board. He had counted his own money the night before. And for the first time in his entire working life, he had understood that counting it carefully was something he now needed to do. He turned and walked out without buying a single thing. Outside in the cold, he stopped on the road, and he looked up at the east hillside. Smoke rose thin and steady from the widow's chimney. The shed beside it sat dark, its door shut tight against the winter. He had stood in that very store once and laughed when Boyd Tanner called her life small and sad. He thought about that laugh now. It tasted like ash in his mouth. He walked home, slow. The hunger moved into the houses quietly. Not the sharp, dramatic kind a person reads about and imagines. The slow, grinding kind. The kind that turns 3 meals into 2, and 2 into 1. The kind that makes a mother eat nothing at all, so that her children might eat something. The kind that makes the old folks sit very still and very quiet near their stoves. Because every movement costs a warmth they cannot replace. The children grew quiet first, not the quiet of contentment. The other kind. The kind children only fall into when something is wrong that the grown-ups around them cannot fix and cannot hide. And the town that had laughed all season long stopped laughing. There was an old man who lived alone at the south end of town. His name was Amos Reed, 61 years old, a timberman, long retired, who had lost his wife some years back and had lived by himself ever since in a small, neat house at the end of a quiet lane. He was the kind of man who would not ask. His woodpile was full. His little house stayed warm. But his pantry had emptied like everyone else's, only he had no one to notice and no one to tell. And somewhere in the long, cold quiet of those weeks, a proud and solitary old man made a decision that proud and solitary old men sometimes make. He decided he would not be a burden to anyone. A neighbor found him one gray morning sitting in his chair near the stove, peaceful, still, gone. Otis Granger had worked beside Amos Reed for more years than he could easily count on both his hands. They had shared cold mornings and hard labor and the bone-deep weariness that only honest work gives a man. When the news reached him, Otis stood outside his own door for a long, long time, not moving at all. He had been telling himself he had enough food to last. He had been telling himself it would all be fine in the end. He stopped telling himself that after Amos. But the loss that broke something open in the very heart of the town was a smaller one. There was a little girl. Her name was Pearl, 4 years old, the youngest in a family that had come to the valley not long before the snow, still finding their feet, still strangers to most. She had been fading since the cold first set in. Her mother had fed her whatever could be found, and what could be found grew thinner and thinner with every week that passed, until there was almost nothing left to give. The little girl slipped away on a quiet evening, with her mother holding her small hand through the dark, and the sound that came from that house that night was the sound of a grief that has no language anywhere large enough to hold it. Marian Doyle heard of both losses within hours of each, and she was on the hillside before first light the next morning, her boots breaking through the frozen crust of the path she had worn smooth between her farmstead and the widow's door over years of patient visiting. She did not knock on the cabin. She knocked on the door of the shed, because she knew, without thinking, exactly where the widow would be. The door opened, and Marian's face told the whole story before her mouth could find a single word of it. She told it the way she told everything, straight. Both names, the old man who would not ask, the child who'd had no say in any of it. The widow listened without moving. She stood in the doorway of the shed, with 232 pounds of preserved summer on the shelves behind her, and she listened to the names of 2 people who had gone hungry in a valley where she, all this while, had food enough to spare. When Marian finished, the widow put one hand flat against the shelving beside her. The wood was cold. The sacks of dried fruit were exactly as she had packed them, exactly as the ledger described them, exactly sufficient. She had watched the trains fail to come. She had heard, through Marian, of the climbing prices and the emptying shelves and the quiet that had fallen over the town. She had been waiting for the right moment, telling herself she needed to be careful, telling herself there was a strategy to this, a wise time, a correct way to do a difficult thing. Amos Reed had been strategic about his firewood, and Pearl had been 4 years old. 4-year-olds do not die of pride. Something moved through the widow's chest then, something heavier than grief, and far sharper. It was the specific, terrible weight of a person who realizes that her own caution has had a cost, and that the cost had not been paid by her. She turned and looked at Marian. "We go down at first light," she said. "Not tomorrow, when it might feel safer. Not when I've talked myself into believing the moment is perfect." At first light. Tomorrow morning. Every day after that. For as long as it takes. Marian did not ask a single question. She had been waiting for those words, longer than she would ever have admitted out loud. They were still standing there, the decision barely cold in the air between them, when the shed door opened behind them. Cold air spilled in. Marian turned. The widow did not. It was the young deputy. His name was Elias Stowe, a lean man, not yet 40, with the face of someone caught in the very middle of deciding something and not yet finished deciding it. He held a folded paper in one hand. He was not pointing it at anyone. He held it the way a man holds something he is not entirely sure he wants to be holding at all. "Mrs. Marsh," he said. His voice carried the flatness of official business, but underneath the flatness, there was something else, something unsettled, something almost ashamed. "I've got an order here. Food safety, sanitation. There's been a complaint about unlicensed food being prepared on an unregistered property." He did not have to say who had filed it. They both knew. The widow turned at last and looked at the deputy for a long moment, and then she reached past him to the little shelf beside the door, and she lifted down her ledger, and she held it out toward him. "Come in then," she said. The deputy stepped inside, and whatever he had expected to find, it was not this. He had seen barns and cellars and smokehouses in his time. He had never in his life seen anything like this. The shelves ran from floor to ceiling on 3 full walls, every surface filled, the boxes labeled in a clear, even hand, the sacks tied and dated, each one in its proper place, and the smell of the place. It stopped him where he stood, sweet and dry and somehow ancient, like the gathered essence of every warm orchard a man might have wandered through as a boy. All of it folded together and held safe in the cool dark. He looked at the ledger she held out. She opened it to the first page and turned the pages slowly for him. Every entry dated, every pound accounted for, every variety recorded, with the method noted beside it in her tidy shorthand. He had been sent up that hill to find a violation. He understood that clearly now. Pike had written the order himself in the back room of his store and handed it over like a man completing some obvious, dreary formality. But there was nothing here to violate. There was only order and precision and a level of care so complete that the paper in his hand began to feel, more and more with every page she turned, like exactly what it was, a small, mean thing. He turned the pages. The widow waited. Marian watched his face from the doorway. When he reached the last page, the deputy closed the ledger carefully and handed it back. He looked at her. She looked at him. And the moment between them was not a hostile one. It was the moment between two people who both understand exactly what is happening here and have arrived from opposite directions at the very same conclusion about it. "Everything looks to be in order, Mrs. Marsh," he said quietly. He folded the order once more, and he walked out of the shed without looking back. On the path down the hill, he stopped once. He stood with his back to the shed and looked out over the town below. The lights were few this early. The smoke from the chimneys was thin and starved. He had a choice to make about what he told Pike. And he understood, standing there in the cold with that paper in his pocket, that it was a real choice, not a small one. Not a clerk's choice, A man could spend his whole life letting other men's orders do his thinking for him, or he could decide just once to think for himself. He took the folded order out of his pocket, and there on the bend of the path, with the wind coming down off the ridge, he tore it. Once, twice. And he opened his hand and let the white pieces go scattering down the white hillside until there was nothing left of it at all. Then he walked the rest of the way down slow. And he did not go to the store. She did not sleep that night. She lay in the loft and listened to the mare shift and breathe in the lean-to below, and to the wind working its slow, patient way through the slats of the shed she had built with her own 2 hands. And she counted, in the dark, the things that could never now be unweighted. An empty chair pulled close to a cold stove. A small hand that had let go of the world too soon, in a house full of strangers. 2 names, heavier, the both of them together, than all 232 pounds on her shelves. She did not weep. Weeping was not her way, and never had been. But she lay awake and let the weight of it settle on her chest and press there until the gray of morning began to seep in through the gaps in the slats. And she promised herself, in the dark, the only thing she had left to promise, that she would not wait again. Not ever. Not for the perfect moment. Not for the safe one. Not for the one where nothing could be taken from her. Because there was no such moment. There never had been. There was only the doing of the thing, and the not doing of it, and the long, cold cost of telling those 2 apart too late. Before the first gray light, she rose. She dressed in the dark, the way her mother had taught her to do anything that truly mattered, by feel, without fuss, without waste. And when she reached for warmth, her hand found the gray shawl folded at the foot of the bed, her husband's shawl. She wrapped it around her shoulders. She held it there a moment, both hands pressed flat to the worn wool. Then she went out into the cold, and she loaded the mare. She did it by feel and by memory, in the half-dark of the lean-to, the way her mother had taught her to pack so that a body would know where everything sat without ever needing the light. She filled the panniers and balanced them even across the old girl's broad and patient back. Dried apple, dried pear, dark plums, cherries. The dense, rich serviceberry cakes she had been pressing all season long. 45 pounds for the first trip down. She would come back for more, the next day, and the next, and the day after that, for as many days as it took to empty every last shelf, if that was what the winter asked of her. The path down the hillside was glazed hard with ice. She went slow, one hand on the mare's neck, the old girl picking her footing with the deliberate care she always showed on bad ground, as if she understood, in whatever way a horse understands such things, that what she carried this morning mattered more than any load before it. The valley opened below them as they came down, the town still dark, a few thin threads of smoke beginning to rise, the whole of it hushed under snow, like a place holding its breath, and the widow led her mare straight to the heart of it. She stopped in front of Harlan Pike's store, the same door, the same windows that had once been dressed to say, without quite saying it, that this was the place all good things passed through. The shelves behind that glass were visible now in the early light, and what they said was very different from what they had said the day she first walked in, 3 years before, with a cloth bag of apple rings and a reasonable request that a powerful man had refused in front of witnesses. Now those shelves said only one thing: empty. She set to work. She lifted 2 boards and a pair of sawhorses down from the sled she had hauled behind the mare, and she built a table right there in the snow, in front of his door, in the gray and growing light. She laid out the dried fruit by kind: apple rings in one section, pear halves beside them, glowing soft and gold even in that thin light, the dark plums, the cherries, and the service berry cakes stacked at the end like small dark loaves of bread. Then she stood behind her table, and she waited. Behind the window of his store, half hidden by a curtain he had not drawn all the way across, Harlan Pike watched her. He had been awake since well before first light. He had seen her come down the frozen hill in the dark, the mare's breath clouding the cold air around them both, and he had understood, with a slow and sinking dread that started in his belly and spread outward, exactly what she meant to do. His face in the gray light was not the face of a confident man. It was the face of someone who has been rehearsing a thing for a long time, and has only just now realized the rehearsal is over and the curtain is already up. At the far end of the road, half in the shadow of a building on the corner, another man stood watching. Otis Granger. He had been on his way to check his woodpile when he saw the figure coming down the hill in the dark. He had recognized the mare first, then the widow, then he had understood the whole of it, and he stopped where he stood, and he watched. The light grew. The town began to stir. And then, at the near end of the road, a small figure appeared. A boy, perhaps 10 years old. His wool cap pulled low over his ears, his coat buttoned all the way to the throat, his face gone thin in the way that a hard winter makes a child's face thin. He saw the table. He stopped. He looked at the dried fruit laid out across the boards in the cold morning air. And his face was the face of someone who has come upon a thing that simply does not belong in the world he has lately come to expect. The widow looked at him, and she kept her voice the way she kept her hands when she worked, steady, unhurried. "Come on," she said. "Take what you need." A pause. "It's free." The boy did not move. He looked at the fruit. He looked at her. He looked back at the fruit again. It was the look of a child who has been disappointed enough times in his short life that he checks twice before he lets himself believe in anything good. And then, slowly, he reached out. He took a double handful of dried apple rings, and he ran. In less than an hour, the whole town knew. They came the way water comes through a crack in a dam. First one thin trickle, then, before anyone can rightly measure it, everything all at once. They came in the order that hunger arranges people. The ones with the least came first, because they had been watching the longest, waiting the hardest, hoping with the particular painful hope of those who have the least room left in their lives to be disappointed. A woman with an infant pressed tight against her chest, hurrying through the snow. 2 small children sent out ahead of their mother because she had thought, in her desperation, that little ones might be turned away less readily than a grown woman would. An old man with a cane, moving with the careful, conserving slowness of someone who has been saving every last bit of his strength for days. And the widow worked behind her table with the very same unhurried care she gave to everything she had ever done. She measured by family. She asked each person gently how many waited at home, and she packed accordingly into the clean cloth bag she had brought down with the fruit. She showed each one how to soften the dried fruit in warm water, how to cook it down slow into something that would stretch further and satisfy longer than eating it dry ever could. She held up a single serviceberry cake and explained, plain and clear, that one of these, the size of a man's palm, held enough to carry a working body through a full, hard day. She said these things once to each person, patiently, clearly, without one scrap of condescension, and without a single word of "I told you so." She did not look toward Pike's window. She did not perform her vindication for the crowd. She was simply there, behind a table built of scrap boards and old sawhorses, doing the thing that needed doing, the way she always had. Marion arrived not long after, hauling her own small sled behind her, potatoes from her root cellar, a crate of eggs from the hens she had nursed through the cold in a little house built warm against her south wall. And the widow folded those gifts into what she was giving out, dividing them by the same careful arithmetic of need. Somewhere in the thick of that morning, a man pushed his way up toward the front of the line. His face was flushed with something that looked, at first glance, like righteousness, though it was really only fear, wearing righteousness like a borrowed coat. "You ought to give more," he said, loud enough for the people around him to hear him say it. "You've got a whole shed full up on that hill. Folks down here are suffering." The crowd went quiet. The widow looked at him. She did not raise her voice. "I'm measuring by family," she said, "so that everyone gets through this week. Not just the loudest of us." A pause. "I'll be back tomorrow, with the same, and the day after that, and every day until the road opens." She held his eyes a moment longer. "Is there a family at home, sir?" The man faltered. Some of the heat went out of his face. He told her how many. She measured his portion. She handed it across the table, and he took it, and he moved on, quieter than he had come. And the people behind him in the line watched the whole exchange with the quiet, careful attention of folk who are deciding, in real time, whether the woman in front of them can truly be trusted. By the look on their faces, they had decided she could. Harlan Pike stayed behind his window. He had been there since before the widow first came down the hill, and he stayed there through the whole long morning, watching his neighbors, his customers, the people whose names filled his ledger, walk past his locked door, one after another, to line up at a table built of scrap lumber by the very woman he had taught them all to call mad. He watched a lifetime of careful logic come apart in front of his eyes. The logic that said value came only from scarcity. That power came from being the one and only source, that a town's respect would always follow whoever held the necessities tight in his fist. He watched all of it become worthless in a single morning. Not through any argument, not through any law or any force or any clever maneuver, but through the simple, unanswerable fact of a woman with food, standing in a place where people were hungry. He did not open his store that day, and up the road, in a fine house gone cold, Boyd Tanner did not come out either. But somewhere in that long, strange morning, a fever finally broke. In a back room of Pike's own house, his youngest child stirred beneath the blankets. The small, racking cough had loosened in the night. The skin, when his mother touched it, had cooled at last. And it was not anything off Pike's empty shelves that had turned it. It was a bowl of warm fruit, softened and sweetened over a low flame, carried home in secret by Pike's wife, from a table she had been too ashamed to be seen standing at. She had stood at the very end of the line that morning, eyes fixed somewhere above the widow's head, the way a proud woman stands when she is trying with all her might to make a moment smaller than it truly is. And the widow had handed her a bag without a single word, without one flicker of triumph crossing her face. The woman had carried it home through the snow, hidden under her shawl, and she had watched her own child eat and live on the plain kindness of the woman her town had spent 3 years tearing down. She did not tell her husband where it had come from. She did not have to. Pike knew. He had stood at his window all morning, and he knew exactly whose hands had reached into his home and lifted his own child back from the edge of the dark, and the knowing of it was the heaviest thing he had ever carried in his life. The next morning, the widow came back, another 45 pounds, loaded in the dark and brought down the icy path. And the morning after that, and the one after that, Marion came each day with whatever the farmstead could spare. The families up the valley, the ones who had traded berry-picking rights for dried fruit in the good seasons, sent down what little they had to add. The table in front of the empty store became something the whole town gathered around, not because anyone had decided that it should, but because a center had formed where there had been none, and people, when they are frightened and cold and uncertain, will always move toward a center that holds. And it held. It held because she held it. On the 8th day, before the light had fully come, a broad-shouldered man walked down to the table while it still stood empty in the snow. Otis Granger. He stood at the end of the bare boards, and he waited. When the widow came down with the mare and began setting out the day's portions, he stepped forward, and without a word, without being asked, he began to help. He lifted the heavy panniers down off the mare's back with the easy, practiced strength of a man who had hauled hard loads his whole long life. The widow let him. She did not remark on his presence. She did not ask where he had been the 7 days before, or the 3 years before that, when she had stood in a store with a bag of apple rings and he had looked at the floor. She simply let him work. And when the table was set, and before the first of the hungry arrived, Otis stood on the far side of it. He did not look at her. He looked down at the neat rows of fruit she had laid out. Amos Reed, he said, was my friend, for more years than I can rightly count. The widow looked at him. I knew you had stores up on that hill, he went on. His voice was rough, working hard to stay level. Everybody knew it, and I chose not to come and ask. His jaw worked. That was a choice I made. Mine. Nobody made it for me. I know, the widow said, quietly. He looked up then, straight at her, for the first time. Why didn't you come down sooner? And there it was. The question she had been asking herself every single morning since the dawn she'd loaded the mare. The question she had no comfortable answer for, and never would. She did not look away from it. Because I was afraid of what Pike would do with it, she said, if I came down before I was ready. I waited until I thought I had enough to hand it out myself, rather than have it taken from me and weighed and priced and sold back to you by the cup." She was quiet a moment, and maybe that fear was even reasonable. "But I waited too long, Mr. Granger. 2 people are gone who maybe wouldn't be. I'll carry that. I won't pretend I won't." Otis Granger looked at her for a long while, and something in his weathered face changed. A settling. As though some heavy thing he had been holding up over his own head all winter long had finally been set down. "At least," he said at last, "you came. There's plenty in this valley, myself among them, who knew and did nothing at all. You came." He stayed at the table the whole morning. He lifted the heavy loads. He kept the line orderly with the natural, quiet authority of a man who had run work crews in hard conditions for 30 years and never once had to raise his voice to do it. He did not make a speech. He did not perform his sorrow, or his shame, or his change of heart. He showed up, and he worked, which was the only language he had ever fully trusted in all his life. Through the weeks that followed, the pattern held. The widow came down each morning. The food went out in measured portions, and slowly, the valley began to come back to itself. Children who had gone pale and listless began to show color in their cheeks again, sometimes within a few short days of eating the concentrated fruit. The men who tried to keep the sawmill running, when it became clear the town needed whatever work and wages it could still find, discovered that the trail cakes she sent down specially for them kept a body upright through a full day's labor, when nothing else on earth could have. Boyd Tanner noticed that. He said nothing about it, but he noticed. His wife, Delphine, did not come to the table herself. Not at first. She sent her housekeeper instead, which was the kind of arrangement a woman of her particular pride could build for herself. A careful way to receive what she needed while keeping up the appearance, for the world and for herself, of not needing it at all. But pride is a poor blanket in a long winter. And on a gray afternoon, Delphine Tanner came to the table herself. She stood at the very end of the line, her eyes fixed somewhere above the widow's head, the way a person looks when they are trying with everything in them to be somewhere other than exactly where they are. The widow handed her a bag of dried pear, without comment. Delphine took it, and her fingers closed around the top of the bag, and she did not move away. She stood there, holding it, and something moved across her careful, composed face that was not any one thing, but several at once. The collision between the woman she had decided, long ago, that the widow must be, and the woman the widow had actually, all this while, turned out to be. She walked away without speaking, but she came back the next day, and the day after that, and somewhere in there, the soft and cutting voice that had once gathered a circle of women and steered them, gentle as a hand on a rudder, toward cruelty, fell silent on the subject of the widow entirely. Some verdicts once handed down can only ever be undone in silence. And what of Harlan Pike? He did not come to the table. A man like Pike could not simply walk up and stand in a line he had built his whole identity on standing above. But he watched every single day, and one evening, after the line had gone home and the widow was folding her empty sacks by the light of a single lantern, he came as far as the edge of the lamplight, and he stopped there. He did not come closer. He stood at the edge of the light with his hat in his 2 hands, a thing no one in that town had ever once seen Harlan Pike do. My boy was sick, he said. His voice was not the voice he used behind his counter. It had lost all its polish, all its easy weight. What was left underneath it was just a frightened man, and a tired one. He's well now. My wife wouldn't say where the fruit came from. A long pause. But I knew. I've known a great many things this winter that I was too proud to say out loud. He did not say the rest. He could not. Not yet. Some confessions are too large to be made in the dark, to one person, with a hat turning in your hands. They need light. They need witnesses. They need to cost you something in front of the very people you wronged. He only stood there, at the edge of the lamplight, a smaller man than he had been at the start of the cold. The widow stopped folding. She looked at him across the small, warm pool of lantern light. "Your boy is well," she said. "Tonight, that's the only thing worth the saying." Pike stood there a moment longer. Then he nodded. Once. Slowly. And he turned and walked back toward his dark and empty store, carrying the rest of it, all the rest of it, home with him to wait for a better place to set it down. The widow watched him go. Then she finished folding her sacks. She blew out the lantern, and she climbed the icy path back up the hill toward the shed, toward the dwindling shelves, toward the small, warm house she had built before she had built anything else for herself in this world. The wind had softened. The snow had stopped its falling, at least for the night. And somewhere far off, past the buried pass, past the frozen line, past the mountains that had sealed the whole valley off from the rest of the world, something was beginning, very quietly, to thaw. She could not have known it yet. But the longest part of the winter was finally, quietly, behind her now. And the woman the whole town had called mad walked home through the snow with her husband's gray shawl wrapped around her shoulders, and her shed nearly empty, and her heart, for the first time in a very long while, something close to full. The thaw came the way mercy often does, slowly, and then, all at once. For days, the valley had felt the change coming before anyone quite dared to say its name out loud. The long teeth of ice along the eaves had begun to weep. The hard crust on the snow had gone soft and gray at midday. And the air, which had carried nothing but cold for what felt like an entire lifetime, began to carry something else, the smell of wet earth, of waking ground, of a whole world remembering, slowly, that it was alive. Folk noticed it the way you notice a fever breaking in someone you love, a loosening, a softness where there had only been hardness. And though no one quite believed it yet, they began, in their quiet and careful way, to hope again. And then, one bright morning, a sound came down out of the high country that the town had very nearly stopped believing it would ever hear again. A long, low cry. A whistle. It rolled down through the valley and into every house at once. And for one long, held breath, no one moved at all, as if they all feared in the same instant that they had only dreamed it, as if to acknowledge it out loud might somehow frighten it away. Then it came again, closer this time, unmistakable, and the town came apart at the seams. Doors flew open all down the road. People spilled out into the slush and the mud and the blinding morning light, their faces turned up toward the pass, toward the sound, toward the wide world that had finally remembered they were there at all. Some of them wept openly, without a shred of shame. Some stood in a stunned and trembling silence, unable to make a single sound. Some simply reached out and gripped the arm of whoever stood nearest. A neighbor, a stranger. It did not matter in the least. Just to feel that the other was real, that they had both come through it, that they were both still standing on the far side of the thing. The road was open. The world had come back. And behind that whistle, somewhere up the line, came everything the valley had gone without for so long. Flour and coffee and salt. The ordinary, blessed, holy weight of plenty. Children who could barely remember the taste of fresh bread stood at the edge of the road and stared up the mountain as though something straight out of a fireside story were coming down it toward them. And in a way, something was. Otis Granger did not run toward the sound with the others. He stood outside his own door, alone, and he listened to that whistle roll down off the mountain. And he felt something let go in his chest that he could not have put a name to if his very life had hung upon it. He had been carrying Amos Reed inside him all the long winter, a weight in the dark, a silence that sat down beside him at every meal and lay down beside him every night. The particular silence of a man who has outlived a friend he might have saved. If only he had been a little braver about asking, a little braver about offering. And now, standing in the soft and dripping thaw, with the sound of rescue rolling at long last down out of the high country, Otis let himself, finally, begin to grieve. Not for the rescue that had finally come, but for the old friend it had arrived far too late to carry home. He bowed his big gray head there on his own front step. And his shoulders, which had hauled timber and held up other men's loads for the better part of 40 years, shook just once. Then he wiped his face with the back of one rough hand, and he went inside to be alone with it, because that was the only way he had ever known how to carry such a thing. Up on the hillside, the widow heard the whistle too. She was in the shed, taking a final count of what remained. The shelves that had once run full from floor to ceiling, the shelves the whole town had laughed at and named, stood nearly bare now. She moved among them slowly, the way a person moves through a house they are about to leave for the last time. She touched the few remaining sacks. She read her own neat labels in the dim and dusty light. 38 pounds. That was what was left. 38 pounds out of 232. She had given the rest of it away, one measured portion at a time, to families she had counted and weighed and worried over in the dark, with the very same care she had once given to the drying of the fruit itself. She heard the whistle roll up the hill toward her, faint and sweet on the softening air, and she stood very still in the cool dark of the shed, and she let the sound of it wash over her, and through her, and out the other side. She did not run down to join the crowd in the road. That was not her way. It never had been. But something deep inside her, something that had been holding itself tight and braced all season long, eased just a little. The way a hand eases when it finally lets go of a rope it has gripped too long and too hard. It was over. The worst of it was truly over. She set one hand flat against the cold wood of the empty shelving, and she let herself feel the weight of that. Not triumph, never triumph, just the quiet, bone-deep tiredness of a thing finished, and finished well. A footstep at the door. Marian Doyle stood in the open doorway, Her thin face lit up with the news, snowmelt shining bright in her hair. "Are you coming down?" she asked. "The road's open. They say the wagons will be in by nightfall. The whole town's out in the street." The widow looked at the 38 pounds left on the shelves. She thought of her mother, of those long ago afternoons when the canning was finally done, and the cellar was full to the rafters, and the winter could come whenever it pleased, because they were ready for it. She thought of how her mother had never once spoken of that readiness as a victory over anyone or anything, only as a kind of quiet completion, the deep, plain satisfaction of a job done right, and done in time. "They have what they need now," the widow said softly. "I've still got work up here." Marion looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that passes only between two women who have stood beside each other through something hard, and who no longer need very many words to understand one another. Then she nodded, the way she always had, as if it made perfect sense, because, knowing the widow as she did, it did. "There's to be a meeting," Marion said, "at the church. Once folks have the supplies in and their feet back under them, they want to say things. To you." The widow's mouth tightened just slightly, as if at the bare prospect of being looked at by a whole room full of people. "I know," she said. "I'll come." The meeting was held a few days later in the largest building the town possessed, the old church at the very center of things, its timbers dark with age, its windows letting in the long gold light of a valley slowly coming back to life. And every single soul who had come through that winter came to it. They filled the pews. They filled the standing room along the walls. They filled the space by the doors and crowded the back, mothers holding children who had grown thin and were now, slowly, day by day, growing whole again. The stove at the front had been burning since morning, and the room was warm. Warm in that particular way. A room can only be warm when warmth has stopped being a thing you take for granted and has become, instead, a small daily miracle you give quiet thanks for. And it was Harlan Pike who asked to speak first. He walked to the front of the room with the slow, deliberate step of a man who has made up his mind to do a hard thing and means to see it through, no matter what it costs him to stand there and do it. He was not the man he had been at the start of the cold, not the easy, confident king behind his counter, setting his prices, deciding who would prosper and who would go without. The winter had hollowed that man out entirely, and then, somehow, against all expectation, it had filled him back up, with something far more honest than what had been there before. He stood before the room, and for a moment he could not speak at all. He simply gathered himself, his hat turning slowly in his two hands. "A while back," he began at last, "a woman came into my store. She had with her a small cloth bag of dried apple rings, and she asked me only one thing. She asked if she might sell them, from a little table outside my door, on market days. That was all." He stopped. He let that sit in the room. "And I told her no. I told her people wanted proper goods, from proper companies, with proper labels. I told her, to her face, that fruit dried in a shed by a widow was beneath the standing of my establishment." He looked out across the crowded pews, slow, meeting eyes where he could bear to. "My establishment," he said, and his voice went flat and bitter, "spent this entire winter with nothing on its shelves but dust and the memory of what used to sit there. There was no self-pity in him, none at all. Only the level, unflinching tone of a man reading aloud from a confession he had already written 100 times over, alone in the dark. When the snow closed the pass and the food ran short, I raised the price of flour, higher and then higher still, because I could, because folk had nowhere else on this earth to turn. I told myself every single night that it was only business. His jaw worked. It was not business. It was a frightened man, mistaking the fact that he held the only supply for the right to do whatever he pleased with the people who depended on him for it. He turned then, and he found her, sitting near the back, in the seat she had taken every meeting since her very first winter on the hill. The end of a pew, near the door, the place a person chooses when they are not entirely certain they belong anywhere, but have decided all the same to show up. The woman I turned away, Pike said. The one this whole town agreed to call mad. The one whose shed we hung an ugly name on and laughed about over our suppers. His voice broke. He pushed through it. That woman fed your families when I could not, and she fed mine. When I had given her every reason under heaven to shut her door and let the lot of us starve. He held her gaze across the silent, crowded room. My boy took sick this winter, a fever that would not break. And it was not anything off my empty shelves that turned it. It was a bowl of warm fruit my wife carried home in secret, from a table she was ashamed to be seen standing at, from this woman's hands. He took a breath and made himself say the last of it. And I'll tell you all the worst thing now, since I've come this far. On the very morning she loaded that old mare to come down and feed this town, I could not feed. I had a paper drawn up against her, an inspection, a complaint. I sent a man up that hill to find something wrong with her, at the very hour she was coming down to save us. There is no kind of sorry that covers a thing like that. But I'm standing here, in front of God and this whole town, to say it anyway. He nodded slowly toward the widow. Mrs. Marsh, I was wrong about your fruit. I was wrong about your methods. And most of all, and worst of all, I was wrong about you. I do not deserve your forgiveness, and I am asking for it regardless. And then he walked back to his seat and sat down. And the room went quiet in the way a room goes quiet when something that has been true for a very long time has finally, at last, been spoken out loud. Boyd Tanner rose next. He was not a man built for smallness in front of a crowd. His whole life had been spent being the biggest voice in any room he ever entered. But he was also a man who had watched his own mill hands eat from the widow's table for weeks on end. And he was a man whose proud, careful wife had come home from that same table one gray afternoon, holding a bag of dried pear, and had sat down at her own kitchen table and wept in a way he had not seen in 20 years of marriage. He had asked her, alarmed, what on earth was the matter, and she had said, "It tastes like summer, Boyd. I'd plumb forgotten what summer even tasted like." And something in that one small sentence had found a crack in the thick, hard shell that men like Boyd Tanner spend their whole lives building around themselves. I stood up in front of half the men in this town, he said, his voice rough as bark, and I called your work a small, sad little thing. born of a small, sad little life. He shook his big head, slow and heavy. I wasn't describing you, ma'am. I was describing my own self, and I think I knew it, even then. I'm sorry for it. Truly, I am. He sat back down, and his wife, beside him, did a thing the town would talk of for years afterward. Delphine Tanner reached over, and she took her husband's hand, in front of everyone. She who had once gathered the women of the valley into a quiet circle and steered them, soft and certain, toward cruelty. She whose gentle, cutting voice had given the shed its ugly name in the first place. She did not stand to make a speech of her own. Perhaps she could not. Perhaps the shame of it sat too deep in her for words. But she found the widow's eyes across the room, and she held them, and she gave one small, slow nod. And in that single nod was every apology she did not have the words to say aloud. The widow received it, and gave one back. Some debts between women are settled in silence, and settled fully. After that, one by one, others rose. A mother stood and spoke, her voice shaking, of watching the color come back into her daughter's cheeks within days of the fruit, when she had begun, in the worst of it, to fear she would watch the very opposite instead. A mill hand, big and awkward and entirely unused to speaking before a crowd, stood and said only that the little dark cakes had kept him on his feet through a full day's labor when his own body had nothing left in it to give. And then he sat down quick, red to the very ears. An old woman near the front rose slowly on her cane and said in a thin, clear voice that carried to every corner of that room that she was still drawing breath, here, today, only because a stranger had troubled herself about an old woman's welfare, before that stranger had a single earthly reason in all the world to care whether she lived or died. And then there was a woman who came in late and stood by the door and did not sit. A woman with a face that had aged a full decade in a single season. The mother of the little girl, the one the winter had taken. She did not speak. She could not. Grief had taken her words from her and had not yet given them back. But she crossed the room, slow, through the parting crowd, until she stood directly before the widow. And she reached out and took the widow's two hands in her own, and she pressed them hard, and she looked deep into the widow's eyes. And in that look there was no blame, only a terrible, broken gratitude, and a grief that they would now, somehow, carry together. Two women, bound forever by a child one of them had borne, and the other had come too late to save. The widow held her hands, and it did not look away from any of it. She had earned, perhaps, the right to look away. She did not take it. "I'm so sorry," the widow said, very low, for the other woman's ears alone. "I'm so sorry. I waited." And the grieving mother shook her head, slow, and squeezed her hands once more, and went back to her place by the door. The young deputy stood briefly. Elias Stowe. He did not make a speech of it. He only looked at the widow and said, plain and quiet, "I'm sorry about that order, ma'am. It never reached a single soul but me. I tore it up on the path coming down, and I'm glad of it." And he sat back down. Otis Granger did not stand at all. He sat in his pew, his big rough hands resting still on his knees, and he kept his eyes down through all of it. And when the others had finished, and the whole warm, crowded room turned, at last, toward the back, toward the woman who had kept every one of them alive, he turned with them, His face was not the face of a man who had been forgiven and freed of his burden. It was the face of a man who had decided to carry that burden from this day on more carefully than he had ever carried anything in his whole life. And then the room waited for her. The widow sat very still for a long moment, and then she rose to her feet. She was not a tall woman. She had never been tall. But the way she stood, the plain, unhurried certainty of it, with no performance in it and no preparation, nothing rehearsed, nothing whatsoever for show, it filled that room in a way that had nothing at all to do with height. "My mother taught me to dry fruit," she said, "and her mother taught her, and hers before that. That's the whole of it, really. There's no mystery to me at all. Only a long line of women whose names you'll never know, who learned how to keep their families alive through hard winters, and who passed it down, hand to hand to hand, all the way down, at last, to mine." She looked out at the faces, the men who had laughed at her in the saloon, the women who had whispered her name in their careful circles, the children who had stood at her table in the cold with the wide, disbelieving eyes of those receiving a thing too good to be quite believed. She looked at all of them, without hurry and without anger. "I didn't fill that shed to prove a single thing to any one of you," she said. "I filled it because I was raised to believe that waste is a kind of sin. Every autumn, fruit fell from the trees all over this valley and rotted into the mud, good food given to the dirt, while this whole town set its faith on things arriving from somewhere far away, on a schedule, printed on paper." A pause. "And paper," she said softly, "is not food. My mother told me that once, a long time ago. I never once forgot it." The room was with her now, entirely. You could have heard a candle gutter. And then her voice changed, went quieter, went somewhere harder for her to reach. "But there's a thing I have to say to all of you, and it doesn't sit easy with me. It isn't kind to me. And I'd be a coward to stand up here and take your thanks without saying it first." The room held its breath. When the cold was at its very worst, when the old man passed, alone in his chair, and when that little girl was lost. Her eyes went, just for an instant, to the woman standing by the door, and then came back. "I was sitting up on that hill, with food enough to have spared them. Maybe. I'll never know now for certain. But maybe." Her folded hands tightened until the knuckles went white. "I was waiting, and I told myself I was being wise. I told myself there was a right moment coming, and that I had only to be patient, or else what I'd built would be taken from me and turned into somebody's profit." She drew a slow breath. "And maybe every bit of that was even true. But I'll tell you what I learned this winter. In the very hardest way a person can ever learn a thing." She looked out at them. "A 4-year-old child does not die of my caution being reasonable." The silence in that room was complete, a held, aching, living thing. "So if you've come here today meaning to make me into something fine and noble, I'll ask you, please, not to. I am not a hero. I am only a woman who knew how to keep food, and who waited a little too long to share it. I will carry that. For whatever years I have left to me, I will carry it. And I'd ask you to carry it too, not against me, but as a thing worth the knowing." She paused, Because the next time someone in this valley has more than they need, while a neighbor down the road has less, I want every last one of you to remember exactly what waiting cost us this winter. And I want you to be braver than I was. And here, at last, the thing that had not happened in all the long seasons since a tree came down wrong in the timber and took her husband from her, happened. The widow's eyes filled, not because she had been praised, not because she had at long last been proven right, after all the cruel and laughing years, but because she was standing in a warm room full of people who were, every single one of them, looking at her, truly looking, seeing her, not the mad woman on the hill, not the strange widow with her useless land and her shed full of foolishness. Her, just her. And she understood in that one trembling moment that she had spent years and years telling herself a lie, that she did not need to be seen, that the work was company enough, and her hands were warmth enough, and a whole town's scorn weighed less in the balance than one single dried apple ring. She had been wrong about that. She had needed this. She had needed it more than she had ever once let herself know. To be witnessed, to be known, to belong at last, to the very place that had spent so long deciding she did not. A single tear traced its way down her weathered cheek, and for once in her whole life, she did not wipe it away. She let it fall where every soul in that room could see it. My husband used to say I was too proud to ask for help, she said, and a small, broken laugh escaped her, surprising even herself. He'd have laughed himself sick this winter, watching me wait up on that hill, watching me be too proud and too careful, right up to the very edge of it, costing everything I had. She looked down at the gray shawl wrapped around her shoulders. His shawl, the one he had given her in the second year of their marriage, because he wouldn't have her cold. He'd have come down off that hill weeks before I ever did, she said, very softly now, almost only to herself. He was always braver about people than I was. Always. I used to think that was a weakness in him. I know better now. I know better, now that it's too late to tell him so. And in the saying of it, something inside her that had been clenched shut for years, locked tight around a grief she had never quite been able to finish, let go. She forgave him, at last, after all this long time, for walking out the door that ordinary morning, for not being more careful in the timber, for not somehow, against every law of the world, still being here, beside her, in the warm and the light and the noise of all these living, breathing people. And in forgiving him, she found, to her own astonishment, that she could finally begin to forgive herself too, for the waiting, for the pride, for the long, cold years she had spent believing that needing no one at all was the very same thing as being strong. The room did not break into applause. It was not that kind of moment, and somehow they all knew it. But Marian Doyle, sitting close beside her, reached over and took her hand and held it tight. And then others reached out too. A hand on her shoulder, a hand on her arm. The whole warm, crowded, weeping room leaning slowly in toward the woman at the back, the way a long frozen valley leans at last toward its first thin patch of spring sun. She was not alone. She had not been alone, perhaps, for some time now. She had only, just now, at long last, let herself feel it. Spring came up the valley after that in its slow and certain way. The pass stayed open. The wagons rolled. The shelves in Pike's store filled up again, bright and proud and full. The children grew sturdy. The fear loosened its grip, finger by finger by finger, until folk could almost forget how tightly it had once held them all. Almost. But something in that town had changed, and it would not change back, because they had learned, in the hardest way a place can ever learn it, that the things you count on from far away can simply stop coming. That a schedule printed on paper is only ever paper, and that the only food a body can truly count on is the food it puts away with its own 2 hands while the summer lasts. And so the widow did the thing she had quietly decided to do, up in her shed, the very morning the whistle came rolling down the mountain. She did not pack her 2 trunks and move on, the way a woman in a sad story might, having proven her point and earned her hard-won peace. She stayed, and she opened her hillside to anyone in the valley willing to learn. She taught them all of it. She held nothing back. The slatted walls and the sliding frames, the salt water dip and the thin honey wash, the plain, hard truth of the difference between fruit that is cooked and fruit that is dried, the patient marriage of steady heat and moving air, the knowledge that had come down to her through a long, unbroken chain of women whose names were written in no book anywhere on this whole earth, but whose hands had kept their families alive through winter after winter after winter, further back than anyone living could rightly remember. She gave it all away, freely, the very same way she had given away the fruit. The grieving mother was the first to climb the hill and ask to learn. The widow took her in like family, and the 2 of them worked the frames side by side through that whole first summer, mostly in a comfortable silence, 2 women with a shared sorrow held between them, slowly turning a grief that could have hollowed them both into something with purpose in it. The boy who had taken that first double handful of apple rings and run, he came too, sticky-fingered and serious, learning the frames as if his very life depended on it, because in the only winter he would ever truly remember, it once had. And by the next autumn, there was not one shed on that hillside. There were a 6 of them, scattered all up and down the valley. The old orchards that had rotted untended for so many wasted years were picked clean now and put up proper. The wild plum and the service berry no longer fell to the mud unwanted and unseen. And Harlan Pike, humbled and quieter, and somehow more decent than the winter had found him, turned over a whole corner of his fine store to a fair exchange, a place where folk could trade and share what they had dried, at prices that no longer climbed the very moment the weather turned cruel. He put a small painted sign above that corner, and the widow, when she first saw it, told him plainly to take it down. He did not take it down. It was, she came to understand in time, his own way of finishing an apology that mere words could never quite reach the end of. So she let it stand, and in time she stopped minding it at all. The shed they had once called the widow's madhouse and laughed about over their suppers, they came to call something else entirely. They called it the first one. And on the long gold evenings, when the day's work was done, and the light went slanting warm across the hills, the widow would sit out on her porch, with her husband's gray shawl about her shoulders, and her old mare grazing slow and content nearby, and she would watch the thin, sweet threads of smoke rising from sheds all up and down the valley, the whole valley putting away its summer, together, so that no winter, however long it stretched, however hard it bore down out of the high country, would ever again find them unprepared or alone. She had come to that place a stranger, with a little money, a wagon of tools, and a grief too heavy for her to carry by herself. They had called her mad. They had called her useless. They had given her shed an ugly name and laughed it all the way down the road. And in the end, she had not changed one single thing about who she was in order to win them over. She had not begged, nor argued, nor performed, nor made herself smaller to fit the shape they had decided she should be. She had only kept doing the quiet, patient, unglamorous work that her mother's hands had long ago taught her hands to do. And the work had outlasted every cruel word ever spoken against her. It always does, in the end. She grew old in that valley, in time. The town grew up full and fed and careful around her, and it never quite stopped looking up the hill toward her with something very near to reverence, no matter how often she waved it off and told them to mind their own frames. And long after she was finally gone, on the first cold afternoon of every autumn, the sheds all up and down the valley would fill once more with the sweet, ancient smell of drying fruit. And someone, somewhere, a child perhaps, learning the frames for the very first time, would ask how it all began. And an older voice would answer, the way it had been answered for years and years. My grandmother learned it from the woman who started the first one. And that was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything she had never once thought to ask for. And somehow, against all the long, cold odds of a single hard winter, had been given to her anyway.